development. But let's get to the issue at hand. It is my great honor to have one of the esteemed political journalists, new media journalists in the country joining us today. She's a fixture on the freedom and liberty market, but at the same time, like her associate Matt Welch, manages to take all of the issues surrounding liberty, our Constitution, personal freedom, and make it accessible to the masses at large. Of course, I'm talking about Elizabeth Nolan Brown. She's the associate editor at Reason magazine. She covers sexual politics, freedom, personal liberty, criminal justice, healthcare, and one of my favorites, the Fourth Amendment. Ms. Brown, welcome to the Coalition. Thank you so much for joining us via Skype from the center of all things important. Of course, I think we're talking about D.C., right?
Thanks for having me on.
Okay. Let's get right to it, because this has been a fascinating week on a couple of levels. If you're a libertarian, if you're liberty-minded, if you believe in small government, if you believe in personal freedom, the current administration represents a challenge, a threat, and some would purport an opportunity. From your unique perspective, and you're not only hanging out in D.C., but you're up at PorcFest in New Hampshire. You lecture across the college circuit. You're seeing it from all perspectives. Are we able to advance the cause of liberty under the Trump regime, or are we merely attempting to create some sort of holding action to hold on to whatever we've got? What's liberty like life right now under the Trumpistas?
I think it really just depends on what area you're talking about. And so at least that's one way that libertarians can play a role, because I think a lot of people are either so partisan that they're just like nothing Trump does or nothing Trump administration does or nothing that happens under this administration can be any good at all. And then you have the other people who are like, well, everything he does is great. So at least I think libertarians play the unique role of being able to be like, hey, look, like a lot of the stuff he does is terrible from a libertarian standpoint, but there are areas and opportunities, like you said, where things can change and can get better. Both because sometimes the Trump administration itself is going to do some good things, and also because when they do bad things, people pay attention in a way that they didn't under Obama. There's a lot of issues I see that people are like, wow, Trump's doing this terrible thing, and it's something that we've been writing about at Reason and other libertarians have been talking about for years under Obama, and no one cared about, especially no one on the left cared about. And now suddenly they're paying attention because Trump's doing it. So at least if you can get over being like, oh, come on, guys, about it, then that presents an opportunity where we can get people paying attention, I think.
How important is it, particularly for the libertarian movement, because some would still use the F word, and of course I'm saying fringe, to stick to the core issues and avoid the politics of emotion?
What do you mean by that?
Well, in other words, the left, the term snowflake, of course, is one of the most grotesquely overused terms this year. It's officially on the list, I think, of words that need to go away. But yeah. The left seems to have some sort of, at times, junior high school cathartic meltdown every time the word Trump is even mentioned, or, God forbid, they're in a public place and they see orange hair. Libertarians, when we're on our A game and not fighting with each other, are issues driven, and we have a core philosophy. How critical is it we stay true to our message now that it would appear that members of the left actually appear open to it?
Oh no, I think you're totally right, because from both the left and the right now, they're looking for people who they know aren't going to be influenced by just the sort of party line, especially because people on the left are looking for some people who can say things honestly and from a limited government perspective, which a lot of, unfortunately, people in the Republican Party aren't. You have people in the Republican Party who are willing to be honest about these things during the Obama years, and now also they're not very willing. A lot of them are sort of jumping on praising Trump regardless. Yeah, I think we definitely play a unique role that way, because we are sometimes the only people willing to call out bullshit regardless of who is spewing it in the government.
Mm-hmm. So. Now, do we, out here, at least on the quote-unquote fruited plain, as the loudmouth with the golden microphone would call us, Hillary derangement syndrome is everywhere, despite the fact that, newsflash, she lost. Newsflash, she's probably not running again. You know, her daughter seems to be building up a case, God forbid, but hopefully that's a long, long way away. What do you, in DC, I should qualify this, is there the level of moral relativism that seems to be everywhere out here with regard to Trump, where when Trump does something as outrageous and unpresidential, just silly and childish, as he did with the, the latest tweet crisis du jour, do folks say Hillary still in D.C. that Hillary would have been worse, or are they just looking past it and just using the opportunity to, out of the public eye, do what they need to do?
I fortunately don't hang out with a lot of Hillary people in DC, so I haven't, I don't really know. I think that most of the people that I hang out with here who are, I hang out with people on all sides, but most people that I hang out with that are on the left or that are liberals or Democrats are reporters, and so they're much more sort of, at least they are much more reflective and open-minded about things, and not so sort of stuck in this sort of delusion about Hillary. Mm-hmm. But when I interact with other Democrat or progressive journalists and things on Twitter or on Facebook or other social media, I think that you do find the same sort of arrangement system where there's just this idea that, there are some people who are like, she's gonna run again, or just who want like her exact sort of thing, and it's like her exact sort of thing failed, and they are still trying to. You see the desperately sort of blaming the Russians and all of that sort of stuff. So,
mm-hmm.
Do you hear a lot about the Russians up there?
The minute any issue is brought up, it almost instantly melts down into this Hillary versus Trump paradigm, regardless of the issue. If the Trumpistas are embarrassed by something, the almost knee-jerk reflection is, well, Hillary would have been worse, or thank God we didn't elect Hillary. That's just the talking point. There are no other talking points. It's still all about Hillary. It's reminiscent of the early days of Obama and his his near obsession with Bush, except it's just on a much broader level. What's disturbing about it as a libertarian is, since maybe not philosophically, but from origin, if you will, a lot of us were at one point in time friends with a lot more Republicans, and their unwillingness to call him out at any level or to point out the obvious, that I thought he was supposed to be better than Hillary, not seemingly just Hillary as an excuse in aping her at every opportunity. That's probably the most disappointing and most disturbing aspect of it, because there seems to be no, and that's why in D.C., is there any Trump embarrassment at all on behalf of any of the Republicans particularly the quote-unquote libertarian Republicans, the Liberty Republicans? Are they embarrassed by Donald Trump?
I think you get two different camps. There is one group that is totally embarrassed by him, and then there is definitely another group that has gotten on board and will try to tell us, or try to tell people our reason, or the libertarians that we need to get on board, and it really is sort of split, I think. Right. But when you said earlier, the idea that people can't conceive of a world beyond this sort of dichotomy is really interesting too, because so I wrote recently a piece about the McCain Institute, which is this think tank that is run by Cindy McCain and was funded by John McCain, and it's very, very corrupt. And but I wrote a piece about why it was sort of awful, and everyone was like, John McCain has been going after Trump, so you must be going after John McCain because you're sticking up for Trump. And you just had people that are just automatically left to that conclusion. Like, we couldn't just be, criticizing the cronyism of the McCain Institute for its own right. It had to be for this ulterior motive of supporting Trump. And I think you see that with so much these days.
Here's the core of the problem. Are we going to be able to accomplish anything in life without this constant knee-jerk reference to Hillary versus? Is the entire world now? Will the World Series be cast in some sort of Trump versus Hillary, paradigm? It's astonishing to me that otherwise intelligent people who can, from wildly different backgrounds, can just be sucked into this political black hole. And meanwhile, should be debating, I don't know, Russia. We could be debating Obamacare. We get to be debating the central role of government in one's life. I've heard, people have told me that we're involved in a couple of military actions around the world. Syria is imploding. All of this is going on. And yet, from what you're telling me, both D.C. and the country is almost paralyzed by this madness. What do we have to do to break out of this?
And it's hard. I mean, it's hard not to be too when you have stuff like Donald Trump this morning or yesterday morning tweeting about the Morning Joe co-host Joe Scarborough and Micah, and then going on this morning. I mean, he goes on these Twitter rants every morning, and people get distracted by them because it's easy to in the media. I mean, that gets a lot of attention. But then you have every morning the media be dominated by this sort of ridiculous whatever Trump decides to tweet that morning. So
I want to get to issues, but my last question on this is, and just, do you think he does this by design? Is this his way of keeping people's eye off the issues ball, if you will, or is this just our American version of the last Scottish king?
Personally, I think the latter. I really don't think that I think it's sometimes there might be, if people are talking bad about him, he might have this sort of like childish impulse, like, I'm going to go change it. But I don't think it's some sort of master plan. I think it really is almost just Trump wakes up or is in the middle of the night watching TV and tweets what he's going to say, and just, because I have friends that are White House reporters, and they talk to sources inside the White House, and everyone is just like a constant trying to keep Trump away from Twitter on like days like the Comey hearings is like a big thing that they're like caught up doing. So
that's great stuff. You've developed an international reputation. You've won awards for your writing on one particular issue that reflects across a broad base of liberty issues. And of course, I'm talking about an article that you wrote a few years ago that you've expanded on and covered extensively. You wrote an article called "The War on Sex Trafficking is the New War on Drugs." Explain to my listeners your philosophy behind that, and what your research and what your reporting has brought to your attention.
Yeah, so at its most basic, if you I came to reason that I started covering prostitution and sex worker rights from the sort of, probably standard libertarian perspective, which is just that I think people should be able to do what they want with their bodies. I think women should be able to sell sex if they want and, not get arrested for it. And then through writing about that, I started, researching more about U.S. sex trafficking, because that's been a big topic too. And it obviously comes into play with anytime you talk about consensual prostitution these days, people are also talking about sex trafficking. And what I found is that, just in a nutshell, that there is a ton of money and a ton of public talk from politicians and that goes in the media about human trafficking and about sex trafficking. But most of what they're doing when they talk about fighting it, almost exclusively, is going after consensual prostitution between adults.
Right.
And when they're not doing that, they're going after things that might fall into areas that we don't think should be legal or we don't think should be desirable, like teenagers being involved in prostitution. But they're not being forced, they're not being kidnapped, they're just, they're 17-year-olds who are front of a home and are selling sex. So those are the kind of two things you have them going after under the guise of sex trafficking. But because they're very, very good at sort of obfuscating this, they've managed to work up sort of almost national panic about it. And therefore, people are really, under the guise of sex trafficking, all sorts of extensions of government power. So you see these things where they're starting to expand wiretap powers, and they're starting to, the FBI and Homeland Security get involved in more local vice policing operations and vice stings, and you see them expanding civil asset forfeiture possibilities, and it's just all these things that really mirror, if you look at the timeline of the drug war and how we ramped up the drug war and how we increased policing powers, increased criminal sentences, and did all of these things in a way where it was sold as cracking down on drug kingpins and people who are going to, come here and sell crack to our children, things like that, and then ended up, sending people to jail for decades for having marijuana or things like that. That's sort of what we see right now, is that there's this whole public thing where we're fighting sex trafficking and we're fighting these big organized criminals, and really the people that are being targeted and the people that are being prosecuted and the people that are going to jail are adult sex workers or people who are working in very small groups with one another consensually and things like that, and not at all this sort of, kingpins. And so that's, I guess, that's the sort of basics of it.
Yeah, there's almost a reefer madness element to it, isn't there?
Yeah.
We've had Bella Robinson, who I believe you probably met and up
Yes.
at Porkfest, is a local activist here. Yep. She's active with Coyote. We've had folks on from the Escort Project. Um, let's take it through step by step, if you will, because what's fascinating to me is number one, the amount of money, the sheer volume of dollars, of federal tax dollars that are being waged, and I use that for two reasons. Number one, as you point out, it's being directed on a very low level to folks who, for many cases, sex work is really an act of economics. It's not a political statement. They're certainly not involved in any sort of large form of human trafficking. And at the same time, the sheer amount of money that used to be, or in some cases still is, being run through the war on drugs, they've taken that almost business model and perpetrated it on the American public. So, what's fascinating to me, is about to say, is that you've got the rise of the Republican Party in one sense. You've got a Republican Senate, House, presidency, and now one could argue a Republican judiciary. Yet you've got alleged small government Republicans who are also piling on this. Now, you mentioned an article a few weeks ago. You've got people like Chuck Grassley from Iowa. What type of madness is he trying to perpetrate?
Oh goodness, and like which one did he introduce most recently? He's introduced a few. I think he has one of the sort of big, omnibus trafficking bills, which combines a lot of different proposals. And that's what you'll also see, is you'll see these sorts of, the first one was passed in 2000. There's been a reauthorization every year. There was a big one in 2015, and now they're trying to pass another one that reauthorizes the 2015 bill. And I think that's the one he was passing. And they'll put one sort of the headline thing in the middle, like we're going to do this thing that's good for sex trafficking and maybe people won't object to. And then tucked in it is just all sorts of small little things, like they're going to, in this one they're going to allow wiretapping capabilities for prostitution.
Right.
Because like wiretapping is supposed to be a thing that police are allowed to use for serious crimes as the thing of last resort.
Right.
Once they've exhausted all of their fact gathering or investigative purposes, and they're adding prostitution to the list. Not sex trafficking. It specifically says prostitution, just plain prostitution. So any sort of a woman selling sex in her local neighborhood now, like they can use the wiretapping for, and it's just chock full of things like that. But back to the business model real quick, like you said. The way that the federal government mainly gets involved in this too is through this thing that they perfected through other operations, including the war on drugs, which is they give a lot of local and state police a lot of money to form human trafficking task forces. And basically there's billions in federal dollars that are going every year or that have gone in the past few years to departments to fight pretty much all just prostitution and local vice, but as long as they call it a human trafficking sting, then they get all this federal money, and the FBI helps out, or Department of Security helps out, or ICE helps out. So they get involved through that, and then usually the FBI will help conduct the sting, and if it's all just local prostitution charges, then they'll just arrest on that, and that's that. If there happens to be anyone that's underage or anything like where someone has crossed state lines and the FBI can charge on federal charges, then they'll charge on federal charges. So that happens routinely across the country these days.
Right, and here's the irony of all this, and this is where the sexual politics are loaded and off the chart. Because you've got a couple of core philosophies here. You've got an entire brand of activism that sees sex work as a legitimate economic activity that is engaged in via free will and by choice. And the notion is, and as a libertarian, we don't legislate behavior. We trust people to make their own personal choices as long as they don't negatively impact others. So by focusing on interdiction on this, there's a clear abrogation of human rights. But what they're really interested in is the money, isn't it? Because police departments have gone wild on this.
Yeah, there's a lot of civil asset forfeiture involved in this. As you've seen the expansion of them doing these things, you've also seen the expansion of laws at the state and federal level and local level, city, municipal level, to allow for civil asset forfeiture for prostitution in various ways. So now, like, if someone is caught buying sex. In a lot of cities, they can have their car impounded. In some states, any sort of prostitution you can have, or if it's maybe not necessarily prostitution, but it's a felony, so maybe promoting prostitution, which can be anything from like driving someone to a prostitution appointment to posting an ad, anything like that, and they can do the civil asset forfeiture. So the cops really like it because the local cops can seize assets, and then when the federal cop, when the FBI has a federal case, then they can have even more. So yeah, that's definitely. And they also get just a lot of good attention too. I don't think we should underestimate the positive social currency they get from this. They get to say we're fighting sex trafficking, and
Right.
they talk a good game about being feminist and not arresting the sex workers because they're victims. But they will only not arrest them if the sex workers agree to say that they're victims. It's almost like a very Salem witch trial thing.
Right.
So.
And yet again, this is, and you mentioned the magic words here, civil asset forfeiture. You've got the specter of a Republican administration, a Republican Attorney General, a Republican Department of Justice, backed by Republican senators and Republican congressmen who purport to be the party of liberty and small government, aggressively posturing, particularly with Mr. Grassley's legislation, to civil asset forfeiture, which, and this goes back to my original contention about, meet the new boss, same as the old boss, that they were verklempt about during the 8 years of the Obaministas. Where's the there?
What's disappointing too is that even people like Rand Paul and people who have been very, pro criminal justice reform, very anti-mandatory minimum. Rand Paul voted for mandatory minimums in the 2015 bill, which said advertisers, so like websites like Craigslist or Backpage, where third parties post ads, could theoretically be held liable with a 15-year mandatory minimum. So you have these allegedly, pro criminal justice reform, pro liberty Republicans even that are willing to sort of suspend those beliefs when it comes to sex trafficking. And I don't know how much of that is ignorance on their part of how the laws actually work, how much of it is just politics. They know they can't be seen voting against it. But sometimes there are Democrats that have voted against it, and Bobby Scott was one of them, like the only one.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. It's just it's disappointing that there's no. I don't know.
There's no accountability. I mean, they again, what they say and what they do is reminiscent of the Obama administration. I mean, plain and simple. Now, I mean, how much of this money, and we're talking, we talk about civil asset forfeiture, of course, then the accountability and the accounting and the money trail becomes very tangled, very tortured. But how much of this money from your personal viewpoint reporting on this actually ends up, and I'm going to get crazy here, and I use this word carefully because of the earlier reference I made to the politics of feminism underlying the sex workers. But how much of this money actually goes to help, whether it be in the form of shelter, substance abuse interdiction, all the cliche byproducts of a life working in sex work, actually goes to help people with this. It's actually precious little, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean that's the saddest part too, is because we're not just making the lives of adult sex workers worse. We're not just destroying civil liberties under the guise of a fake moral panic. We're also taking resources away and time and attention and everything away from the people who actually could use it and who are exploited. It doesn't happen nearly as much as they say,
right.
But of course there is actual sex trafficking. Of course there's actual exploitation in the sex industry. Most of the time when it happens, it's not the point of someone being kidnapped and, chained to a radiator. It's a teenager who has run away from home and ends up what they call doing survival sex because
right.
they don't have a place to stay. And it's someone who's left a bad relationship. Or it's a sex worker who was doing it on their own accord, but then they, got an abusive boyfriend that they thought was their boyfriend that turned out to be a pimp who was abusive.
Right.
These people need, like you said, emergency shelters. They need quick places to get away, to get help, to get resources, a job opportunity, things like that. And that's exactly the thing we don't give money to. We give money to cops to arrest them or to arrest people who want to pay them. And we give money to these sort of social service nonprofits, which are a mix of sort of Christian right and left liberal feminist groups. And they're all anti-prostitution at their core. And then they sort of latched on to anti-sex trafficking as a way to do it. And they get all this money to counsel victims and teach them how to get out of the life, or
Right.
to give them yoga and art therapy, or to like provide case management and refer them to different social services. But then they refer them to the social services, and there's no room because the social services themselves, that are actually material resources, don't actually get funded for these things. We fund the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is this ridiculous, just sham, and it's a ton of government money, and it's going to get even more because it's about to go global. And all it does is people call, and they mandate the different states that they hang it everywhere, at truck stops, at gas stations, at strip clubs, at hospitals,
Right.
at libraries. And then people call and they can have tips. If they think they saw prostitution happening, they can report it. If they want information about it, they can call a tip. So more and more people call as it gets posted. Not necessarily anything related to trafficking, but they'll call this number, and then the more calls there are, the politicians will use it every year to say, there are this many more calls, so we need to fund it more. And it just gives so much of the money that's supposed to be helping sex trafficking victims is going to these glorified telephone operators that are funded by government money. So
Right, and here's where the dollar is. We do a project here on our show, The Coalition. We about once a year will research the 990s, the charitable tax returns of these organizations. And by the way, folks, this is public information. You can do it. It doesn't require a lot of digging, just a little bit time consuming, and you need to know your way around a tax return. Do it a couple times, and you're an expert. We've got a local organization that I won't mention that receives several $1 million a year in grants, and the executive director, her compensation package is almost $200,000 a year, with precious little money going to shelter, rent vouchers, health checks, any of the practical day-to-day issues that these folks actually have to contend with, as opposed to this reefer madness like imaginings of this.
right, informing their souls, and you hear all about like, oh, they need all this specialized therapy. Okay, first they need a place to freaking stay, and that's that. There was this one in Texas, the Covenant House, and it closed down last year. And I wrote about it, and they actually got really mad. They kept writing us, and apparently everyone wrote back about them because they were kind of they were shown to be a scam. And they were getting $10,000 a month or $9,000 a month per girl that stayed with them. They only had maybe like 5 of them. They used them in all this publicity, but they didn't really provide them with anything.
Right.
And now a year later, it came out that they actually had to totally shut down because just like there was the more of an investigation, and this woman was just living. She was a grifter. She was, but this industry attracts it because it's so easy right now for people. There's so much grant money and so much awareness that anyone who comes in and claims to be, to have a nonprofit that's going to help will can get in on it, and it's really sad.
And it's a perfect example of government gone wild, because at any level, have you seen any federal attempts at accountability for how this money is spent? Or let's get crazy, folks. Results. Do you see any attempt to get this, or is this just politicians pandering to a hyper-aware public who are being played to almost like a Pulp Fiction novel of the 50s? I mean, is there anybody following up?
One of the people in the Office for Trafficking Victims, I forget exactly what the acronym is, but one of the people that's sort of in charge of doling out the grant money was one of the founders of Polaris Project, that group I just told you about that runs the hotline. So, one of the biggest recipients of this grant money is now in charge of doling out the grant money. So no, of course there's no accountability. This is an old statistic, but one of my favorites, or an old anecdote, but one of my favorites is a 2008 Government Accountability Office report was looking at trafficking statistics up until that point that had been pushed by Homeland Security and the DHS, and they've been passing all these bills in Congress with these. And they said the statistics should not be believed because they had been compiled by one man who his methods had been flawed, and also he did not document any of his work. So for 8 years, the federal government had just been like pushing these statistics from a man who was just one man who didn't document any of his work. And the government telling us was like, don't believe these. And you still see them pushing out these same studies that like no one even knows where these numbers came from. There's literally no documentation. This guy just sort of like, hey. So,
each study referenced another bogus study that then purports to go back to another study that can't be referenced. And it's a circular effect. Now, here to me is the tragedy. And I know as libertarians we don't like to use the T word very often, but the tragedy in this is, with all of this effort, with all this litigation, with all this money, with all this time, the Sturm und Drang of the federal government getting behind shutting down trafficking, are the lives of the everyday sex worker any safer than they were, say, 10 years ago?
No, I'd say they're actively worse.
Right. Now, explain why.
Well, no, there's been technology, but I mean, so there's been great technology that's helped the lives of the average sex worker, no matter if they're doing it 100% by choice or a total economic whatever. Be so much safer because now they can go online. They don't have to go stand on the street and just get in the car with anybody. They don't have to rely on a middleman, a madam, or a pimp or an escort agency necessarily to post the ads. You know, it's so easy for anyone from their phone to post an ad, to email with the person first, to actually sort of screen them. There's been, you know, like all these review boards where actually that has helped. And every time there's these things that could make their lives safer and easier, the cops come in and shut them down under the name of helping them.
Right.
That's what's really worse, is because we're losing all the gains that technology is giving us that could make sex work safe. You know, clients for the sex workers and for trafficking victims, because, you know, people would be more willing to report them if it wasn't, you know, this whole infrastructure set up to get them. But instead, we're doing everything exactly the wrong way, I think. So. Right,
and the federal government effectively went after Craigslist, then the federal government went after Backpage, clear abrogations of First Amendment rights, and and by the way, and you may or may not be aware of this, Rhode Island, up until a few years ago, was one of the few places in the nation where sex work, as long as it was conducted in private, was actually legal. Through a quirk in the law, through your typical, well, in this case, it was a good effect, but it was bad jurisprudence, of which Rhode Island is famous for. When women's rights advocates so correctly pointed out before the state representative, the House of Representatives, and the state Senate, that in fact you were endangering these folks by forcing them back out on the streets, because simply the demand would continue to exist, the practice would continue to exist, the reasons, the variety, and there's so many myriad reasons of factors promoting men and women getting involved in sex work. So all you were doing was essentially pushing it off, into the streets. Yet, as is so typical of government, particularly on the state and local level, no one was interested in the facts. They never really want to know the facts, do they?
No. I mean, you see this in Seattle too, where they shut down one of the big local boards. That was the same sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And when you had all of these people saying that's the exact same thing, it was just like, the sheriff even said, like, well, if they have to think about going back on the streets, maybe they won't do it, or something like that.
Yeah. Okay.
It's almost sociopathic how cruel it is, just ignorant to people's realities. It's just like wishful thinking, and it's Yeah,
and projecting your own morality, and then perverting your entire alleged, and I always use the word alleged when it comes to Republican and Democratic political belief systems, in order to stand it on your head for some type of temporary political convenience or advantage. And the willingness to do so while simultaneously endangering people's lives is staggering. And one of the most unreported aspects of this, of course, is because the myth machine that is Washington and the reefer madness, like what we'll call a trafficking madness that's been generated, is of course the stereotypical 17-year-old girl who left the farm and went into the big city and ended up as a drug abuser. When, in fact, when you talk about survival sex, it's just as likely to be a man as it is a woman, isn't it?
Right. Oh, yeah. Or a man or transgender youth are also they're very much in that population. Mm-hmm. And just one story real quick I want to tell is with the Seattle thing too. They arrested a lot of men in that case for felonies for writing on the review board, and that was basically all that they had them. Was writing reviews of prostitution on this board, which is a crazy from a first member's perspective, but they got charged with promoting prostitution, a felony, because they wrote reviews, and some of them made the case trying to argue like, well, my client didn't actually do it, they just wrote this online. Then the prosecutors stepped in and said, if you guys don't plead guilty, we will add a sex crime, sexual motivation enhancement, and 4 charges for every post you did, and another felony charge. So almost all of them pled out. I think maybe 1 or 2 of them are still trying to fight it, but they all pled out because that's how they can sue, So It's either now just literally writing online about prostitution can get you a felony charge.
Right, right. Or engaging in non-money related consensual sexual activity can be postured as promoting prostitution now as well. And it can throw you, and folks, and the danger of all of this, of course, is once you get that arrest, once you're placed on the list, you're done. I mean, all sorts of avenues in life are shut down to you because of the behavior.
These people are thinking, maybe no big deal, but okay, they got their names in the papers as part of a sex trafficking sting, even though all they've done was write online about encounters with adult women. A lot of them lost their jobs because of it. They had to pay all sorts of money. They had to pay, just as one example, $900 to go to a 10-week John school where they learned about toxic masculinity. And the group has a deal with the Seattle government, this nonprofit group, with the King County government, where they send them all to this John school and they all work together. So,
yeah, it's and what's the lesson here? What ultimately is the motivation for government to do all this? Why do you suppose they go to all this trouble? Is it to enhance personal safety?
No.
Has anyone ever put, and if you have time, if anyone of your sources ever report this, because I doubt there is one comprehensive number, but civil asset forfeiture, how much money has been raised because of small offender drug violations and or small time offender sexual violations? How much money has been absconded with, stolen by the government in the name of keeping us all safe from our own consensual behavior? I would love to know that number, because I have to imagine it is, I can't even begin to guess. If not the hundreds of millions, if it maybe even more. Which then essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong, all goes to fund the beast.
Yeah, exactly.
So just like Mothra, who needed gamma rays from pollution, the government essentially becomes dependent on the cash flow generated by these ginned up criminal activities, which are merely acts of consensual behavior.
You'll see, so the one thing I always want to tell people is when you see things about human trafficking or sex trafficking things in the media, read to the bottom, because there was one I think yesterday, and it was Homeland Security participated with about 6 different California law enforcement agencies to arrest 3 men for trying to pay for sex. And all the first 10 paragraphs is all the travesty of human trafficking with cops talking about it. And you get to the very bottom and it's like, we arrested 3 men for pay for sex. We seized this many assets. And so, it'll usually say, and it's just, they'll seize thousands or if it's a cross country one, they'll seize millions of dollars in one sting. And that's just like, okay, that's where we're actually going with this.
So, just absolute madness. Some other issues. What in this administration, if we can, the Fourth Amendment, which folks, by the way, if you're a statist or you're a recovering statist, that's that whole illegal search and seizure thing. This is a president who openly advocated, based on flawed statistics in a political debate, a support for what's called here in the Northeast stop and frisk. This is a president who, what was his line? It was a very, very bad, a very, very not good judge who deemed it unconstitutional. Amongst all of this, what do you see, or what's the word in D.C.? Is this Justice Department just hell-bent to to just go back to the bad old days of 10 years ago? Do you see them upping the war on drugs and further creating violations of the Fourth Amendment? Do you see, any hope at all for cannabis legalization? What's your perspective?
I sure think that Jeff Sessions wants to do all the terrible things that you just mentioned. Mm-hmm. And the only reason I'm not terribly freaked out about it is that there's so much dysfunction here within it that you never know, right? I think when we got to Sessions, everyone was sort of like, shit, this is going to be awful. And yet, so far, the DOJ has been mostly hampered by this internal scandals and this ridiculous, Donald Trump's whims and things. So On the one level, I know we were talking earlier about the distractions and how it's terrible that we have all these ridiculous distractions every day, but maybe that's a good thing because the one thing that all these distractions are preventing is the actual things that the Trump DOJ wants to do, and that's definitely a plus.
Yeah, no, because one of our main concerns here at the coalition, Rhode Island was really the first in the nation to embrace medical cannabis. Came up with a really early, we're really early adopters of a pretty comprehensive program to facilitate the growth, the distribution, the packaging, and the I'll call it the medical licensing, if you will, of medical cannabis. Now we've got a Democratic governor here who was very popular in D.C. It's interesting. She's got two images, one here locally, which is not so good, whether you be a progressive Democrat or a liberty person. And then she's got an active PR machine. The word on her was that she was out of town if Hillary won. That's one of the reasons why we're sad Hillary lost here. But she actually attempted last year to create a very aggressive taxing scheme on medical cannabis. All sorts of outcries, largely beaten back, not totally. But now you've got the Sessions, the Jeff Sessions. Do you see, is their word out, or do you see them aggressively going after medical cannabis out of D.C.?
No, I don't. Just because I think it is so politically unpopular. I don't see there being any good developments, but I don't think at least that they're going to go after medical cannabis and that they're going to go after these things. And even just because, I mean, like, you know, like I have friends in like the weird Republican consulting world, and they've all got medical cannabis plans in their states. Right. You know, I think that there's so much behind the scenes, conservative, liberal, whatever, just non-political. There's so much behind the scenes money involved in that being an industry now that has been established that, and Donald Trump, if nothing else, does sort of, you know, value what business industry does. So I hope, I want to hope that they're at least not going to backtrack on that in that regard. But I do think that we can see things like a return. I mean, like a return to more just prosecutions of non-medical in states where it's not legal and things like that. So.
Right. You spend a lot of time. First of all, you're, from my perspective, you're a very young person, but you also spend you spend a lot of time, and we're grateful for it. With, you know, at places like PorcFest, you know, interacting with YALs, you know, at the college level, there's a connection there that's fantastic. If you're let's just say hypothetically, you're a middle-aged, beaten-up liberty warrior who treads the statist blue waters of Rhode Island, what's your thoughts on the youth? We see significant potential amongst young college people, young millennial, blue collar, white collar. We just see a tremendous potential because of their open-mindedness towards a variety of issues that couldn't have happened when I was in college. What's your perspective on young America right now in terms of liberty?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think like there are good and bad indicators, but overall, you look at the Republican Party, and despite the rise of sort of, you know, a lot of people who might have said they were libertarians and were sort of wrong about that, they may have siphoned off to the alt-right in the young group. There's definitely a group of young people that have done that. But by and large, the people that are just mainstream young conservatives these days are 10,000 times more libertarian than the mainstream young conservatives of, you know, a decade or two ago even. Because like you said, you know, they're supporting medical marijuana or even recreational marijuana. They're supporting gay marriage. They're not so concerned with these. They're much more libertarian in a cultural lens. Within the young libertarian movement itself, I think there's a lot of great signs. You were seeing much more energy before this past election, especially, you know, like in 2015 and the beginning of 2016 with regards to Rand Paul. And I think when I've talked to people at libertarian and conservative, there's a lot of sadness amongst the young libertarians and conservatives because they are more libertarian oriented and they're not happy about Donald Trump. But just my favorite thing actually is just that there's so many young women in the libertarian movement these days, and that's amazing. I first went to my first libertarian conference in 2005, and just even in the past 12 years, like shift has been incredible. And you hear it from people older than me, and obviously the shift has been even bigger. But even in my time in the libertarian movement, I mean, just like the amount of young people at young women at libertarian things is really great, because for a long time it was just such a boys club, even at the young level, and so it's really great to see that. I think that's providing a lot of fresh energy too, because there's so many ways that we can reach out to a lot of women on issues that libertarians have historically been bad at, that are capturing these people's energy in this way.
Two questions, if you will. A number, I'll call it the mid 30 to early 40-year-old libertarians, all cut their teeth on the Ron Paul campaigns. They were there post-college. They came of age politically for Ron Paul. Do you sense a real disappointment in the transition from Ron to Rand?
Yeah.
And why is that? Why do you suppose that is?
I mean, I think everyone wanted Rand to be Ron Paul, and he's not. And we all got disappointed by that. I'm in my early 30s, so this is definitely my group. And I wasn't a Ron Paul libertarian. I came in a little bit before that. But still, even though I might not be, Ron Paul definitely had this energy, and he had this way of connecting to people, both within already libertarian circles and outside, that Rand Paul just didn't have. And I think that Rand Paul was good in a lot of ways, but that was, I think, just disappointing for all of us.
You say, is it time for liberty-minded Republicans to get over Rand Paul? Is it time to move on yet?
Yes, I say yes. I think that he's just he's shown too much willingness to come. I mean, like anyone, like we're willing to give Donald Trump, say good things about him when he has good policy. Of course, when Rand does good things, great. But I think that we shouldn't be looking to him as sort of any great libertarian anymore. Mm-hmm. It's sad because we don't really have a lot of alternatives. But
well, therein lies the big challenge, doesn't it? If you come from our neck of the woods, we've decided, at least locally, to focus very much on local and regional politics, because there is no bench. And I'm a little L and a big L, but particularly with the Libertarian Party, we've got the tendency to take people out and divert them towards federal offices, which may be by and large, and this is certainly not a shot at these folks, because they're wonderful, but by taking that energy and directing it to a federal level that we may not be, not the candidate, but the party infrastructure may not be ready to truly support yet, we continue to find ourselves in this catch-up mode where, as we look to 2020 on the Libertarian Party, do we have any, tested, battle-ready elected people that we can move up to the next level? It's this Groundhog Day that we keep experiencing. What's your recommendation to the libertarian movement on local elections versus what do we do for the presidential nomination?
I'm probably a bad person to ask about this, because I tend to agree that we just shouldn't. I mean, obviously we should have a presidential candidate, but that's just not where my interest or really knowledge is. I think that what you were saying about working through local politics is absolutely the answer, and also that for the people who are focused on national politics, like us at Reason or the Cato Institute or the think tanks in the Capitol, focusing on policy, not politicians. We focus on people at the local level and focus on policy at the national level is really the only way that I sort of look at it. I'm really glad that there are people that are concerned with who the libertarian presidential candidate is going to be, but that's sort of a different realm, I think.
Well, we're big Gary Johnson fans here. Despite the ups and downs of the campaign, we remain committed to having Gary Johnson at some level as an elder statesman in the Libertarian Party. On a personal level, I find him to be an exemplary human being. Again, during the candidacy, there were ups and downs. Our principal disappointment, obviously, here in Rhode Island, was with the vice presidential choice. Not because of any personal failing, but his almost chronic failure to take an opportunity at the national level to articulate a libertarian message. We actually, this is all local stuff, but we actually asked Mr. Weld not to come to Rhode Island because of what happened on the Rachel Maddow show. And to us, it wasn't him vouching for Hillary, although that's what local people are obsessed with that created so much difficulty for us. For us, it was just a huge missed opportunity on national TV with a gentleman who's respected by the body politic to articulate a clear libertarian message. Just a month or so ago, we had Matt Welch here from your magazine. We had Arvin Vora, and we had Larry Sharp here. Have you seen any folks at the national level that have impressed you with the potential not to win the presidential office, but to live and articulate that message with the bully pulpit that we as individual libertarians help create? Is there anyone that strikes you yet, or is it still just too early to tell?
There's not, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I'm sorry that I don't have a better answer there. Because, like you said, yeah, I think Gary Johnson was, when you look at him, I mean, on paper, in his policies, or even just I got to interact with him some, like, one-on-one when he was doing reason things, and such a good libertarian, so bad at conveying his ideas to a mass audience. Just, Bill Weld aside, Johnson I mean, sometimes he was great, and sometimes he was just so off, and unfortunately, though, I don't know who is a better option right now.
That's something I hope.
I'm full of optimism here right now today.
No. And these are the hard questions. This is, ultimately, it's this type of introspection on a public level that political organizations that still have philosophies that still reflect actual movements as opposed to the political expediency machines that are the Republican and Democratic Party. This is what we need to do. This is the debate we need to have, because unlike, say, the Republicans or the Democrats, who every 8 to 12 years lurch about seeking a philosophy so that they can retain whatever elements of power they have, we have a philosophy, we have a clear belief system. We're looking for someone just who can articulate it on a national level. I mean, that's really the big battle we face right now. And so it's disheartening on one level, but I think we all need to be honest with each other at this point, don't we? We all need to have that little, that little, well, what's the first step? Problem recognition, So
yeah.
Serenity now. Anything big you're working on right now? We only got a couple minutes left. Anything big you're working on right now, or what's a message that you would give to folks here in the Northeast? Socialist Workers Paradise. I love you, my progressive friends, but Socialist Workers Paradise. What's the message you would give us, and what are you working on right now that you think might facilitate that?
Whew. I have not really been working on. I was just at work. That's and I've been working on a lot of vacationing recently. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that I've been working on actually was just like I mentioned, this Cindy McCain thing, this McCain Institute piece. Cindy McCain is the appointed ambassador at large for human rights by the Trump administration, and her group has been some of the worst at doing this sort of fake sex trafficking help, which has really just been a great expanse of authority. Meanwhile, her husband John McCain takes in Saudi money and then weird international mining companies and bring them together behind the scenes while under the guise of McCain while she's doing this. So as she gets considered for this thing, which is going to be announced soon, ambassador for human rights, watch out for that and try to spread the word about her and how her institute is terrible, because pretty much all the mainstream media when this was announced was like, this is so great, she's such a humanitarian. I started looking at her humanitarian work. Her best known charity she founded to give drugs to needy children in the 90s, and then stole the drugs for herself to feed her own drug habit, and forged prescriptions using her employee's name. And the DEA was investigating her and everything, and then let her have a deal where she just had to go to treatment. And now that's just sort of swept under the rug, and everyone's like, Cindy McCain, great humanitarian. So that's my current crusade is against their fake sort of crony charity work at the McCain Institute.
Maybe if she would just do a Pepsi commercial, it would be all better, right? Exactly. Elizabeth Nolan Brown, Reason Magazine. First of all, time for shameless plugs. Where can folks read about you? Where can they see you? Where can they learn more?
You can find me at reason.com. You can find me on Twitter at EN Brown, like Elizabeth Nolan Brown. And also, I'm starting a new group called Feminists for Liberty, which is a libertarian, sort of young libertarian feminist organization. And you can find that at Feminist Liberty on Twitter or feministforliberty.com.
Excellent. As that develops, we would certainly love to hear more about that in Rhode Island. Thank you for spending a good part of your Friday evening. Thank you for the work you do. We look forward to hearing great things from you in the future. Folks, Elizabeth Nolan Brown, Reason Magazine, destination reading. Bookmark it, make it your homepage, embrace it. Thank you so much for coming on our show tonight.
Thank you so much for having me on. This has been lovely. Have a good evening.